The year is 2009. America stands at a crossroads. 82 million people are living without health insurance or struggling under crushing medical debt. Families are losing their homes to pay for chemotherapy. Parents are choosing between groceries and their child's insulin. And in the halls of Washington, a newly inaugurated president is about to make a promise that will define his legacy and transform the lives of 32 million Americans. His name is Barack Obama. And this is the story of how one man's determination would face an unprecedented storm of opposition, death threats, and political warfare that would last 427 grueling days. But before we enter the battlefield of Washington, we must understand what drove him there. We must meet the people whose stories haunted his sleepless nights. We must know Emily. Emily Patterson was 34 years old when she found the lump in her breast. A school teacher from Ohio, she had health insurance through her employer, or so she thought. When the diagnosis came back as stage 2 breast cancer, Emily submitted her claim for chemotherapy. That's when the insurance company found it. A pre-existing condition she hadn't even known about. An irregular heartbeat documented during a college physical exam 15 years earlier. The insurance company called it material misrepresentation. Emily called it a death sentence. They denied her coverage, all of it. The chemotherapy she needed cost $40,000 for the first round alone. Emily and her husband drained their savings. They borrowed from family. They held fundraisers at the school where she taught. But cancer doesn't wait for bake sales. By the time they'd raised enough money for treatment, the cancer had spread to her lymph nodes. Stage 4. Emily Patterson died on November 3, 2008. Election Day. The same day Barack Obama won the presidency. Her husband, Robert, watched the victory speech from a hospital chapel, still wearing the clothes he'd worn when he'd held Emily's hand as she took her last breath. And he wondered if things might have been different. If someone, somewhere, might finally do something about the system that had killed his wife. Robert's story was one of thousands, hundreds of thousands. But it was one that would reach the new president's desk within weeks of his inauguration. And it would become the fuel that kept Barack Obama fighting when everything and everyone told him to give up. January 20th, 2009, Inauguration Day. As Obama placed his hand on Lincoln's Bible and swore to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, he was already carrying a weight that few understood. In his jacket pocket was a handwritten list. 47 names. People who had written to him during the campaign. People who had died because they couldn't afford medical care. People like Emily. The celebration lasted one night. The work began the next morning. Obama had been fighting for health care long before he reached the White House. Back in 1997, as a state senator in Illinois, he'd witnessed the same tragedies on a smaller scale. He'd pushed legislation to expand coverage for children. He'd held town halls where parents wept, telling stories of kids denied treatment for asthma, diabetes, leukemia. He'd won some battles and lost others. But he'd learned something crucial in those years. The system wasn't just broken. It was designed to fail the people who needed it most. Now, as president, he had the power to change it. But power in Washington is never absolute. It must be fought for, negotiated, defended. And there were forces gathering in the shadows who would stop at nothing to make sure healthcare reform died before it could be born. The insurance industry saw what was coming. Executives convened emergency meetings. Lobbyists flooded Capitol Hill. $33 million a month. That's what the insurance companies spent fighting healthcare reform in 2009 alone. $1.4 million every single day to preserve a system that made them billions while Americans died. But Obama had something they didn't. He had Robert Patterson's letter and hundreds more like it. Letters that arrived daily at the White House. Stories of tragedy that would have broken a lesser man. Obama read them every night. His staff would later recall finding him in the Oval Office at 2, 3 in the morning, surrounded by letters from Americans begging for help. There was Marcus, a 9-year-old boy with leukemia, whose parents were told by their insurance company that his lifetime maximum benefit had been reached. He'd used up his $1 million in coverage at age 7. Now they were on their own. The treatment he needed cost $30,000 a month. His parents were told he had 6 months to live without it. There was Jennifer, a woman with multiple sclerosis who was dropped from her insurance when she got too sick, too expensive. The insurance company combed through her medical history and found she'd failed to disclose a yeast infection from 5 years earlier. They called it fraud. They left her with no coverage and a disease that would eventually take everything from her. There was Daniel, a construction worker who fell 3 stories on a job site. His back was shattered. He needed surgery immediately, or he'd be paralyzed for life. But he was an independent contractor, no health insurance. The hospital demanded a $50,000 deposit before they'd operate. Daniel's family couldn't raise it in time. He's been in a wheelchair for 6 years now. These weren't statistics to Obama. They were people. They were the reason he'd run for president. And they were the reason he was about to walk into the most brutal legislative battle in modern American history. By February 2009, just weeks into his presidency, Obama had assembled his team. The strategy was clear. Healthcare reform had to pass in the first year. If they waited, if they let momentum slip, the opposition would grow too strong. They had one shot. 427 days. That's all the time they'd have before the political window closed forever. The opposition was already organizing. Conservative groups were forming across the country. The Tea Party movement was gathering steam. And behind closed doors, Republican leadership was making a calculation. A cold, political calculation. If Obama succeeded in passing healthcare reform, he'd be unstoppable. His presidency would be defined by historic achievement. Democrats would dominate for a generation. They couldn't let that happen. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said it privately to his caucus in February. It leaked to the press later, but by then it was too late. The strategy was set. Total opposition, not a single Republican vote. Make Obama own it completely, and if it fails, make sure the failure destroys his presidency. 41 Republican senators signed a pledge. Not one vote for healthcare reform, no matter what, no matter how many Americans were dying, no matter how many compromises Obama offered. The answer would always be no. But Obama had fought impossible battles before. He'd won a Senate seat nobody thought he could win. He'd defeated Hillary Clinton in a primary everyone said was hers. He'd become the first black president in a nation still struggling with its racial wounds. He knew how to fight, and he knew how to win. March 5th, 2009. The White House held its first healthcare summit. 120 lawmakers, industry representatives, and advocates crowded into the East Room. Obama stood at the podium and made his case. Passionate. Personal. He talked about his mother, Ann Dunham, who died of ovarian cancer at 52. How she'd spent her final months fighting with insurance companies instead of focusing on treatment. How she'd worried more about the bills she'd leave behind than the life she was losing. The room was silent. Some were moved. Others were calculating their next move. Because in that room were people who'd already decided Obama would fail. Who'd already planned the attacks, the speeches, the sound bites that would dominate Fox News and talk radio for the next year. After the summit, Obama returned to the Oval Office. His chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, was waiting. The news wasn't good. The Congressional Budget Office had released preliminary cost estimates. $1 trillion over 10 years, maybe more. The sticker shock was immediate. Republicans pounced. How can we afford this in a recession? Democrats wavered. Is this the right time? Obama made a decision that night. He would own this fight completely. Every attack, every setback, every compromise would be his responsibility, but so would every life saved, every family that didn't go bankrupt, every child who got the treatment they needed to survive. He called Robert Patterson, Emily's widower, the man whose letter had been one of the first he'd read after inauguration. Obama spent 40 minutes on the phone with him, listening to Robert describe Emily's final days, the pain, the fear, the unfairness of it all. When Robert asked if the president really thought he could change things, Obama didn't hesitate. I promise you, this will pass. Your wife's death will mean something. We're going to make sure no one else has to go through what Emily went through. It was a promise that would cost Obama everything. His political capital, his relationship with his own party, his family's safety. Because within days of that phone call, the threats began. The Secret Service intercepted the first one in mid-March. A letter addressed to Michelle Obama. Inside were explicit, graphic threats. What they would do to her if her husband didn't abandon healthcare reform. The language was vile, the intent was clear, terrorize the first family into submission. More threats followed, dozens, then hundreds. Some were crude letters scrawled by angry citizens. Others were sophisticated, organized. The FBI traced several back to shell companies, funded by insurance industry executives. Not direct threats from the companies themselves. That would be illegal. But money flowing through layers of organizations, eventually landing in the hands of extremists who were more than happy to make the threats real. In one threat specifically mentioned Sasha, the president's youngest daughter. She was 7 years old. The threat described her route to school, the times she left the White House, what would happen if healthcare reform moved forward. The Secret Service tripled her security detail. Michelle Obama was furious, terrified. She confronted her husband in the residence late one night. Is this worth our daughter's safety? Obama had no good answer. How do you weigh one child's safety against millions of children who would die without healthcare reform? How do you make that choice? He held Michelle and promised her that security would keep them safe. But privately, he asked himself if he had the right to put his family in danger for a political goal, even one that would save lives. The threats were kept quiet. The media didn't know. The public didn't know. If they had, the insurance industry's involvement would have become the story. And Obama needed to keep the focus on the policy, on the people who were dying, not on the violence being threatened against his family. But the stress was unbearable. Staffers watched Obama age in real time during those months. The silver in his hair spread. Lines deepened around his eyes. He slept 4 hours a night, maybe. Some nights he didn't sleep at all. Some nights he'd sit in the Oval Office reading letters until dawn, then head to back-to-back meetings with lawmakers, trying to salvage votes that seemed to disappear faster than he could count them. By April, the legislative strategy was taking shape. By April 2009, the legislative strategy was taking shape. Obama needed 218 votes in the House of Representatives and 60 votes in the Senate to overcome a Republican filibuster. The math was brutal. Democrats had the numbers, technically, but having members of your own party and getting them to vote together are two very different things. Conservative Democrats from red states were terrified. Vote for healthcare reform and face certain defeat in the next election. Liberal Democrats wanted single-payer, Medicare for all. Anything less felt like betrayal. Moderate Democrats wanted compromise with Republicans, bipartisanship, even though Republicans had already made clear no compromise would ever be enough. Obama began making calls, personal calls, from the Oval Office, from Air Force One, from the residence at midnight. He called wavering Democrats and spent hours listening to their concerns, their fears, their political calculations. He made promises, campaign support, presidential visits to their districts, meetings with their constituents, whatever it took. Representative Bart Stupak from Michigan was one of the hardest calls. A pro-life Democrat who threatened to vote no unless the bill explicitly banned federal funding for abortion. Obama needed Stupak's vote and the 9 Democrats who followed his lead. Without them, the bill was dead. The negotiations went on for months. Stupak wouldn't budge. Obama couldn't alienate pro-choice Democrats. The coalition was fracturing before it had even formed. Meanwhile, the Tea Party was exploding across America. Town halls that summer became war zones. Democratic congressmen were shouted down, threatened, hanged in effigy. The anger was real, even if much of it was stoked by organized opposition, funded by the insurance industry and conservative billionaires. Americans were scared. Scared of change. Scared of government overreach. Scared of socialism. Though most couldn't define what that meant. Death panels, that's what they called them. Sarah Palin, the former Republican vice presidential candidate, posted on Facebook in August claiming Obama's plan would create death panels that would decide whether elderly Americans lived or died. It was a complete fabrication. There was nothing in the proposed legislation even remotely resembling that. But the lie spread like wildfire. Suddenly, grandmothers across America were terrified that Obama wanted to kill them. The White House pushed back, Fact-checkers debunked it, but the damage was done. Polling numbers dropped. Support for healthcare reform fell below 50%. Democrats in Congress panicked. Maybe this wasn't worth it. Maybe they should scale back. Do something smaller, something less risky. Obama refused. He'd made a promise to Robert Patterson, to Marcus's parents, to Jennifer, to Daniel, to the thousands of Americans whose letters filled his desk. He wasn't backing down. Not for poll numbers, not for Tea Party rage, not even for his own party's fear. August recess arrived. Traditionally, this is when congressmen return to their districts, meet with constituents, recharge for the fall session. In August 2009, it became a bloodbath. Democratic representatives faced screaming mobs at town halls. Some were accused of treason. Others received death threats of their own. The insurance industry and conservative groups bussed in protesters. They distributed talking points. They turned local meetings into national news events. One congressman, a moderate Democrat from Pennsylvania, held a town hall in a high school gymnasium. 400 people showed up. For 2 hours, they screamed at him, called him a traitor, a Nazi, a socialist. Someone brought a poster with Obama's face photoshopped onto Hitler's body. The congressman tried to explain the bill. Nobody listened. When he finally left, his car was surrounded. People pounded on the windows. Security had to escort him out. That congressman voted no on healthcare reform. So did 12 others who faced similar scenes. The Tea Party riots were working. Obama watched the news coverage from Camp David. He was supposed to be on vacation with his family. Michelle and the girls wanted normal. Beach time, family dinners. But Obama couldn't focus. He spent hours on the phone with Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, and Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader. They were losing votes. They needed a new strategy. The decision was made. Go big. Don't compromise with Republicans who would never vote yes anyway. Use the Democratic majority and pass the most comprehensive reform possible. Cover as many people as possible. Ban pre-existing condition exclusions. Expand Medicaid. Create insurance exchanges. Make it so transformative that Republicans couldn't repeal it later without facing a backlash from millions of Americans who'd gained coverage. It was a gamble, a massive political gamble. If it failed, Democrats would lose the House in 2010. Maybe the Senate too. Obama's presidency would be crippled. But if it succeeded, 32 million Americans would get health insurance. Hundreds of thousands of lives would be saved over the coming decades. Obama returned to Washington in September with a plan. He would address a joint session of Congress, prime time, make the case directly to the American people, bypass the Tea Party rage and the insurance industry propaganda, speak from the heart about why this mattered. September 9th, 2009, the House chamber was packed. Senators, representatives, Supreme Court justices, the cabinet. Cameras from every major network, millions watching at home. Obama walked down the aisle shaking hands, smiling, projecting confidence he didn't entirely feel. He took the podium. And for 47 minutes, he made the case. He told stories, he cited statistics, he addressed the lies directly. There are no death panels. You can keep your doctor. This isn't a government takeover. He was passionate, commanding, presidential. And then someone shouted. A Republican congressman from South Carolina named Joe Wilson stood up and screamed, "You lie!" The chamber gasped. In the entire history of joint congressional addresses, no one had ever done that. The disrespect was staggering. Obama paused, locked eyes with Wilson, and said quietly, "That's not true." Then he continued, but the damage was done. The moment went viral. Conservative media celebrated Wilson as a hero. Liberal media condemned him as a racist. The substance of Obama's speech was lost in the controversy. And worse, it emboldened the opposition. If a congressman could shout down the president in Congress, what couldn't they do? The Tea Party grew bolder. Protests intensified. And in late September, a Fox News segment aired that would change everything. A leaked document, allegedly from an internal insurance industry strategy meeting. The document outlined a plan to fund extremist groups, to encourage threats against Democratic lawmakers and their families. to create enough chaos that healthcare reform would collapse under its own weight. The document mentioned specific targets, congressmen in swing districts, and it mentioned the Obama family, suggested that threats against Michelle and the girls would be particularly effective in making the president back down. Fox News ran the segment as an exclusive. Other networks picked it up within hours. The Washington Post, the New York Times, Politico. All scrambling to verify the document's authenticity. The insurance industry immediately denied it, called it a forgery, a political smear. But the FBI launched an investigation. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. The Tea Party rage looked less like grassroots anger and more like manufactured chaos. The threats against lawmakers weren't random extremists. They were part of a coordinated strategy. And Obama wasn't the villain trying to force socialism on America. He was a father trying to protect his family while fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Polling shifted. Support for healthcare reform ticked back up. Democrats who'd been wavering found their courage. The leaked document, whether authentic or not, had exposed what many had suspected all along. The insurance industry would do anything, pay any price, threaten anyone to preserve their profits. Obama seized the moment. In October, he gave a fiery speech at a rally in Maryland. 20,000 people packed into an arena to hear him. He was angry in a way the public had rarely seen. He talked about the threats his family had received. He didn't go into detail, but he made clear that people had tried to intimidate him into giving up. And then he said the line that would define the rest of the fight. They threatened my wife, they threatened my daughter, they thought that would make me quit. They don't know me very well. I don't quit. I don't back down. And I sure as hell don't let insurance company hitmen tell me what's right for the American people. We're passing this bill for Emily, for Marcus, for Jennifer, for Daniel, for every single American who's been denied, dropped, or bankrupted by a broken system. And we're doing it now. The crowd erupted. The speech went viral. Within days, donations poured into Democratic campaign committees. Volunteers signed up to help with outreach. The momentum had shifted, but the fight was far from over. In the Senate, negotiations were bogging down. Republican senators weren't just voting no, they were using every procedural trick to slow the process. Filibusters, amendments, endless debate. The goal was to drag it out until 2010, when midterm elections would likely shift the balance of power. Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader, was in an impossible position. He needed all 60 Democratic senators to vote yes, every single one. Lose even one vote and the bill would die. And there were at least 5 Democratic senators who were on the fence. Some represented conservative states where healthcare reform was deeply unpopular. Others had specific policy concerns. All of them knew their votes could end their careers. Obama went into overdrive. In November and December, he made personal appeals to every wavering senator. He invited them to the White House. He flew to their states. He promised whatever he could promise. Political cover, campaign support, compromise on specific provisions. Senator Ben Nelson from Nebraska was particularly difficult. A conservative Democrat who opposed the public option and had concerns about abortion funding. Obama negotiated for weeks. Finally, Nelson extracted a deal. Extra Medicaid funding for Nebraska. A compromise on abortion language. It was ugly. It looked like a bribe, but it got Nelson's vote. Christmas Eve 2009. The Senate worked through the night. At 7:13 in the morning on December 24th, the Senate passed its version of healthcare reform. 60 votes. Not a single Republican yes, the narrowest possible margin. But it passed. Obama was in Hawaii with his family for the holidays. He got the call at dawn. He stepped out onto the balcony of his vacation rental and looked at the ocean. Michelle joined him. They held hands. Neither spoke for a long time. It wasn't over yet. The House and Senate bills had to be reconciled. More votes, more negotiations. But for the first time in 427 days, success seemed possible. The holidays passed. The Obama family returned to Washington. And then, disaster struck. January 19, 2010, a special election in Massachusetts. Ted Kennedy's Senate seat vacant since his death in August. The Democrat lost. A Republican won in one of the bluest states in America. The 60th vote was gone. Democrats no longer had a filibuster-proof majority. Healthcare reform was dead, or so everyone thought. January 20th, 2010, the morning after the Massachusetts defeat, the White House was in crisis mode. Senior advisors gathered in the Roosevelt Room. The mood was funereal. Rahm Emanuel, Obama's chief of staff, laid out the brutal reality. Without 60 Senate votes, they couldn't pass a new bill. Republicans would filibuster anything. It was over. Some advisors suggested scaling back. Pass something small, incremental reform, declare victory and move on. Others suggested abandoning healthcare entirely. Focus on the economy, on jobs, come back to healthcare later. Maybe never. Obama sat quietly, listening to his team dissect the political carnage. Then he stood up. He looked around the room. And he said 5 words that changed everything. We're not giving up. Period. The room fell silent. Emanuel started to object. Mr. President, the math doesn't work. We don't have the votes. Obama cut him off. Then we find another way. We didn't come this far to quit now. Nancy Pelosi had the answer. A procedural maneuver called reconciliation. The House would pass the Senate bill exactly as written. No changes. That meant no new Senate vote required. Then, they'd pass a separate reconciliation bill to fix the parts House Democrats hated. Reconciliation only required 51 Senate votes, not 60. It was risky. It was unconventional. But it could work. Obama made the call. Do it. Whatever it takes. February 2010, Obama launched a final push. He held a bipartisan healthcare summit, televised live. 7 hours of discussion with Republicans and Democrats. Obama sat in the middle, moderating, explaining, debating. Republicans attacked the bill relentlessly. Obama defended it point by point. He knew Republicans wouldn't vote yes. That wasn't the goal. The goal was to show the American people that he'd tried everything, that Republican opposition wasn't about policy. It was about politics. The summit changed few minds in Congress, but it reminded the public why this mattered. Obama told Emily's story again. He told Marcus's story, Jennifer's story, Daniel's story, and he introduced new stories, stories of people who'd contacted the White House in recent weeks. There was Laura, a 29-year-old woman from Colorado who'd been diagnosed with breast cancer just like Emily. But Laura's diagnosis came in January 2010, after the Senate had passed its bill but before the final vote. Laura was terrified. She had insurance, but it had a lifetime maximum. The cancer treatment would exceed it within months. Then she'd be on her own, just like Emily. Laura wrote to Obama. She begged him not to give up. She said her life depended on it. Literally. If the bill passed, lifetime maximums would be banned. She'd get the treatment she needed. If it failed, she'd be Emily. Another statistic. Another preventable death. Obama read Laura's letter at the summit. His voice cracked. Republicans sat stone-faced. But Americans watching at home weren't stone-faced. They were crying. They were angry. They were energized. The calls and emails to Congress exploded. Millions of Americans demanding their representatives pass the bill. The Tea Party organized counter-protests. The battle lines were drawn for the final fight. March 2010. 3 weeks until the vote. Obama postponed a trip to Asia, canceled every non-essential event. He spent 18 hours a day working the phones, calling Democrats, listening to concerns, making deals, promising support, begging for votes. Representative Bart Stupak was still holding out. The abortion language wasn't strong enough. Obama needed Stupak and his bloc of pro-life Democrats. Without them, the bill would fail by a handful of votes. The negotiations were excruciating. Pro-choice Democrats were furious at the concessions being offered. Pro-life Democrats wanted more. Obama was caught in the middle, trying to hold together a coalition that was fracturing in real time. Finally, a breakthrough. Obama agreed to sign an executive order reaffirming that no federal funds would be used for abortion. It wasn't in the bill itself, which Stupak had wanted, but it was something. On March 20th, Stupak announced he'd vote yes. His bloc would follow. The votes were there, barely, 219, one more than needed. March 21st, 2010, the day of the vote. The Capitol was surrounded by protesters, Tea Party activists on one side, healthcare reform supporters on the other. The noise was deafening, chants, screams. The tension was explosive. Inside, Democrats were doing final head counts. Every member was accounted for. No one could get sick. No one could change their mind. This was it. Obama was in the Oval Office. He'd done everything he could, made every call, every promise, every compromise. Now it was out of his hands. He sat at his desk, watching C-SPAN, waiting. The debate on the House floor was vicious. Republicans gave impassioned speeches about government overreach, constitutional violations, the death of American freedom. Democrats countered with stories of constituents who died for lack of coverage, of families bankrupted by medical bills, of children denied treatment. 7 o'clock, the vote began. Electronic voting boards lit up, green for yes, red for no. The greens climbed slowly. The reds climbed faster. Obama's heart pounded. This was 427 days of work coming down to minutes. 200 votes. 210. 215. The pace slowed. Holdouts were making their final decisions. 216, 217, 218, they'd reached the threshold. The bill would pass, but the voting continued. Final tallies mattered. Every additional yes vote was armor against future attacks. Proof that this wasn't just a narrow partisan victory. 219, 220. The gavel came down. The bill had passed. 219 to 212. The chamber erupted. Democrats cheered. Republicans walked out in protest. Outside, the Tea Party protesters screamed in rage. Some spat on Democratic congressmen, leaving the building. Racial slurs were hurled. The ugliness that had simmered for a year boiled over. But in the Oval Office, Barack Obama sat quietly. He called Nancy Pelosi, "Thank you." He called Harry Reid, "Thank you." He called Robert Patterson, Emily's widower. He told him the bill had passed, that Emily's death hadn't been in vain. Robert wept on the phone. "So did Obama." Then Obama called Laura, the young woman with breast cancer. He told her she was going to be okay, that her treatment would be covered, that she had a future. Laura couldn't speak. She just cried. Obama told her to fight, to beat the cancer, to live the life Emily never got to live. March 23rd, 2010, the signing ceremony. Obama stood in the East Room of the White House, surrounded by lawmakers who'd fought for the bill, by families who'd be helped by it, by people like Laura, who'd flown to Washington to be there. Obama signed the Affordable Care Act into law, multiple pens. Tradition dictated he used different pens for different letters of his signature so he could give them away as mementos. He signed slowly, deliberately. Each stroke of the pen was a promise kept. When he finished, he stood up and addressed the room. He talked about the fight, the obstacles, the threats, the setbacks, and then he talked about what it meant. 32 million Americans would gain coverage. Insurance companies could no longer deny coverage for pre-existing conditions. No more lifetime maximums, no more dropping people when they got sick. Children could stay on their parents' plans until age 26. Medicaid would expand to cover millions more. It wasn't perfect. Obama acknowledged that. There were compromises, things he'd wanted that didn't make it in. A public option, single payer. But it was transformative. It was historic. And it was the foundation for future improvements. He ended with the line he'd said to Robert Patterson months earlier, the promise he'd kept despite everything, for the people. Always. The room applauded, but Obama knew the fight wasn't over. Republicans had already vowed to repeal the law. 50 times over the next few years, the House would vote to repeal it. 50 times the effort would fail. The Supreme Court would challenge parts of it. States would refuse to expand Medicaid. The implementation would be messy, plagued by technical problems and political sabotage. But the law survived, and millions of Americans got coverage. People like Laura, who beat her cancer and lived to see her 30th birthday, her 35th. She's alive today because Barack Obama refused to quit. The stories continued to pour in. Letters to the White House from people who'd been saved by the Affordable Care Act. A diabetic who could finally afford insulin. A child with leukemia who got the transplant that saved his life. A young woman who discovered she had a heart condition during a free preventive screening and got treatment before it killed her. Obama kept every letter. Thousands of them. When critics attacked the law, when Republicans called it a disaster, when the media focused on website glitches and premium increases, Obama would read the letters, reminders of why it mattered. In his final weeks as president, in January 2017, Obama gave a farewell address in Chicago. He talked about his presidency, the accomplishments and the failures, and he talked about health care. He said the Affordable Care Act was the achievement he was most proud of. Not because it was perfect, but because it proved that government could work for ordinary people when leaders had the courage to fight for them. He told one more story that night, about a letter he'd received just days earlier from a man named Robert Patterson, Emily's widower. Robert had remarried. He had a daughter now, a little girl named Emily, after his first wife. And because of the Affordable Care Act, little Emily had health coverage from the day she was born. Pre-existing conditions didn't exist anymore. Lifetime maximums were gone. If she ever got sick, she'd get the care she needed. Robert wrote that his first wife, Emily, hadn't died in vain, that her story had helped push a president to keep fighting when everything told him to quit, that her memory lived on in a law that would save countless lives. Obama's voice broke as he read the letter aloud. Tears streamed down his face. He looked at the crowd and said, "This is what change looks like. It's hard, it's messy, it takes time, but it's worth it. Every sleepless night, every threat, every compromise, it's worth it." The crowd gave him a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. Today, more than 20 million Americans have health coverage because of the Affordable Care Act. Hundreds of thousands of lives have been saved. Millions more have been protected from bankruptcy. The law isn't perfect. Healthcare in America still has profound problems, but it's better than it was. And it exists because one man made a promise and refused to break it. Barack Obama faced death threats against his family. He endured 427 days of political warfare. He sacrificed his relationship with his own party. He spent every ounce of political capital he had, and he did it for people he'd never meet, for children who'd grow up healthy, for parents who wouldn't have to choose between medicine and rent, for families who wouldn't be destroyed by medical debt. The insurance industry tried to stop him. The Tea Party tried to stop him. Republicans in Congress threw every obstacle they could in his path. 50 repeal attempts, endless lawsuits, state-level sabotage, but the law survived. Because Obama had built it to survive. He'd made it big enough, comprehensive enough, transformative enough that taking it away would hurt too many people. In the end, that was his genius. He didn't just pass a law. He changed what Americans expected from their government. He proved that the system could work for ordinary people, not just the powerful. He showed that courage and determination could overcome even the most entrenched opposition. Laura is 44 years old now, cancer-free for 14 years. She has 2 kids, a career, a life Emily never got to have. And every year on March 23rd, she sends a letter to Barack Obama, thanking him, reminding him that she's alive because he kept his promise. Obama keeps those letters too, along with thousands of others, physical proof that leadership matters, that fighting for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it costs you everything, can change the world. The Affordable Care Act wasn't just about healthcare. It was about what kind of country America wanted to be. A country that let people die because they couldn't afford treatment, or a country that believed healthcare was a right, not a privilege. Barack Obama answered that question. With 427 days of relentless work, with personal sacrifice, with courage in the face of threats and opposition that would have broken most people. He answered it for Emily, for Laura, for Marcus and Jennifer and Daniel, for Robert Patterson and his daughter, for 32 million Americans who gained coverage. He answered it with a promise kept, for the people, always.